Thank you very much. We welcome everyone who's watching us live in this live premiere, and we welcome everyone who's watching us sort of live on tape. We appreciate your on-demand views over the course of the next several months. It's my pleasure, John Levitsky, to serve as the moderator. I have a panel of speakers with complementary skills. We have Bob Muser, Catherine Puffer, and Tom Walsh. I'll say a little more about them in a moment. And what I'd like to do is just point out a few of the things that are in the slide deck that's been made available to our attendees. Today's program is co-sponsored by Financial Poise that provides education for attorneys, accountants, business owners, executives, and investors through programs like this one today. And also the co-producer, the National Law Review. It's a legal news website that has analysis on a wide range of legal and business topics. It's a resource for a lot of types of legal, business, and other professionals and the public. We also thank Max Assets for being a co-sponsor. It's a group of restructuring and insolvency professionals and bankruptcy trustees. And a little disclaimer, this is intended to be a dialogue and to get open insights from the professionals on our panel, but it's not intended, this is not advice for any particular situation or any particular party. You should consult if you have those types of situations where you want to get direct advice. You should consult with your own attorney or your own other advisor. And in that vein, any of us on today's panel welcome questions. The email address for any of us and all of us is in the slide deck. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Bob Muser from Bodmer Price and Light, Catherine Puffer from VH Valuation Services, and Tom Walsh from Brody and Wilkinson. Bob is a highly experienced professional in business valuation. He has several decades of experience, both with consulting firms and with major accounting firms as a valuation professional. Catherine is with the firm of VH Valuation, which I mentioned. She also has several decades of experience in financial analysis, business valuation, and forensic accounting. Both Bob and Catherine are based here in Chicago. We also have Tom Walsh. Tom is a corporate attorney. He focuses on general corporate matters, business transactions, finance, and commercial real estate. He is based in Connecticut, and the bios and the emails for each of our speakers are here. And just by the way, to be complete, I should mention I'm John Levitsky with HKA. I do business valuation and forensic accounting work. I'm based here in Chicago as well. Today's program is What's It Worth? Valuing a Business for Sale. So before going to market, would it be helpful to get an independent appraisal, whether you are the seller, or on the other hand, might it be helpful to a prospective buyer to get a valuation? We're going to talk today with our panel about how valuation experts look at the valuation of a going concern and some of the perspectives from the corporate lawyer who may be advising in these types of situations. Today's program is the first in our 2026 series. We are What's It Worth? Valuing a Business for Sale. There are a handful of other programs, and we're going to jump into our program. The slides are here for you to use as notes or reference, but we're not going to flip through the slides. So with that, I turn back to the cover slide as a background, and we're going to talk to our panel about a dozen or 24 topics. And as I mentioned, the purpose is a dialogue, a conversation. So we'll start with Catherine and Tom. When should a business owner get a valuation? Catherine, open
Well,
for us.
in terms of if you're thinking about selling your business, let's just focus it down to that because there's a lot of reasons that you might want to get a business valuation when you're a business owner. But just focusing on that, and let's say you're trying to sell your business, are you thinking about it? One of the important reasons to get a valuation is you want to accurately price your business. Um, Selling too low is obviously something you do not want because you want to get as much value as possible. But pricing too high can delay a sale or create unrealistic expectations about what you can get and might delay the sale as well or result in no sale at all. One of the things that I do want to talk about in this vein is that business owners and the business owners I deal with are small business owners, which is the bulk of my practice. They talk about multiples. They talk amongst themselves, and they talk about what businesses like their business have sold for. These are just averages, and I have found that small privately held businesses are somewhat unique, and it's important to base the value on the cash flows and the risk of that particular business. So I'll generally use those I'll use similar sales and common multiples as reasonableness checks. And if they're different, I have to explain why. But I generally look at what that particular business is producing in terms of cash flow and what that particular business has in terms of risk. And I'll talk more about that later as we go through the program. Another reason that a business valuation might be very helpful when you're negotiating, when you're selling your business. It might really help in the sale negotiation, particularly if the buyer and the seller both consider the appraisal to be neutral and objective. If you're a buyer, you might want to know more about the business. Obviously, you want to do your due diligence or find out as much about the business as necessary to make a purchase. And a business valuation is a good place to start that process. You may need an appraisal to finance the business if you're purchasing it through a bank as well, or any type of financier. Um, you might want to buy out minority shareholders to avoid a shareholder dispute, or just give them a way to provide liquidity for their investment. If you're planning an expansion, you may want it to use a business valuation to set a price for issuing stock. And if you're selling to a family member or a long-term employee, the appraisal can be used to justify your sale to price to the IRS, so you don't have gift tax issues or compensation issues as a result of the sale. So if the sale is less than what is considered fair market value, the IRS may want to charge the long-term employee compensation. With all that said, it's better if you get an appraisal, say 4 to 5 years before the sale, because that would give you a chance to potentially increase the value of your business. Or you could do it anyway, but you could see better what would help you improve the value of your business, including expenses, reducing expenses, that's obvious, but collecting receivables faster, reducing inventory, just tightening up your management of those two assets could help increase the value of your business by increasing cash flow. And the other thing that I see a lot in small businesses, is that there's a lot of small businesses have large customers. That really increases the risk and reduces the value of small businesses. So anything that you can do just generally to avoid having large customers whose, if you lose them, it could really hurt your business. Anything you can do to avoid that would be good. So that's kind of what I have to add to that. John, Bob or Tom, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I could add something, Catherine. As John mentioned, I'm a corporate lawyer. I mainly help business owners who have businesses worth between 10 and $50 million, or sell their companies for that kind of value. And so I'll be speaking from that perspective. But in my experience, there can be both formal valuations like what Catherine was talking about. That can be a valuation report where you say in a situation where somebody's making a gift of equity and they think there's a possibility of an IRS audit. Or it could be in a contentious situation where an equity owner is being bought out. But there can also be what I've heard people talk about are back of the envelope valuations or seat of the pants valuations that I sometimes see business owners get from their valuation providers right before a sale. And as Catherine said, I agree with her 100% that it's a better thing to do years in advance because then you have time to build up the business in the meantime. But a lot of my clients like to have at least the, quote, seat of the pants, unquote, valuation. And if they're using an M&A advisor, which a lot of my clients do, it gives them a good feel for the market, gives them a good feel for the value of the business before they go to the market. And especially if they're going to auction the business off for sale, it's not necessary to get something more detailed at that late date. And a lot of M&A advisors will provide that as part of their sale package. And the only other thing I would add is, with a lot of small and medium-sized business owners, they often own real estate associated with the business. So it's important also to get that valued in the context of a buyout or in the context of getting the business ready for sale, just so you can have an idea what the value is for that real estate. And a lot of the times, the lease payments might be above market for the business because it's convenient for them tax wise to do it that way. So I would just make that other note.
Thank you. Tom, as a follow-up, you'd mentioned essentially succession planning, maybe a motivation for a seller thinking about exploring potentially selling the business. Is there one or a handful of crucial mistakes that you've seen that business owners make that you'd suggest that they think about ways to avoid?
Yeah, I mean, this is somebody's, life's work when they're selling their business, privately held business. And when you get close to selling the business, or maybe you've even signed a letter of intent to sign the business, it's too late, and you can be too emotionally involved to make some of the changes you might otherwise make. So, not being prepared is the single biggest mistake that I see people make. That can be manifested in several different ways. It might be not having the right team in place to market the company and close the deal. Many buyers of small and medium-sized companies are backed by private equity firms, and they use, large out-of-state law firms to represent them in the transactions. So you need to have an experienced M&A lawyer at your side if you're the business owner. Having an M&A advisor, in my experience, is worth the money for sellers. In my experience, they can often get an increase in the purchase price to pay, if not fully pay their fee, pay a lot of their fee. You can be in a negotiating disadvantage if you don't have an advisor. So having an advisor at your side before you sign on to a deal, that could be a mistake not to do that. It's a months long sprint, to sell your business. Once you sign a letter of intent, the ownership team has got to do all their regular work, along with doing all their work on the transaction, and missing projections, missing your numbers can be devastating. It can result in a retrade of the purchase price, possibly losing the deal. So, not being prepared, um, is the biggest mistake. And I would just add on to that, not signing, it's important not to sign a letter of intent without talking with your lawyer or financial advisor, because that's a critical time where you can negotiate a better deal. A lot of times I see business owners rush into a letter of intent and they think because it's not binding, it's not a problem, and they can always circle back. But there's a few problems with that. Um, there can be binding parts of those documents. There can be an exclusivity clause. Um, there can be other binding parts to it that could handcuff a seller. And once the letter of intent becomes the script that the lawyers follow when they're drafting the final documents. So even though it's not binding, it has a great size effect as to what the final deal terms are going to be.
Well, thank you, Tom. Catherine, we've been talking about value, but in an actual transaction, is the selling price fair market value, or is that always the case? Sometimes the case?
It can be, but generally no. I mean, when I value businesses for taxes, litigation, et cetera, I generally do fair market value, which is the value to a hypothetical buyer. But in the case of this buying and selling, um, the you're you're selling to a specific buyer that likely has reasons, plans on making some changes that will increase the value of the overall um, business and the business with together with the business that they currently own. And that's referred to as a synergy. And generally that is called investment value, and it increases the value of the business. And I'll talk more about the synergies later in the program. I do want to add a couple things to the discussion that Tom just had about and I want about getting advice during the sale and some of the pitfalls. One of the things I've run into is that when uh, the really tiny businesses that I deal with, um, they're generally asset sales, and um, when they're sold, they're not sold with the cash and receivables and the debt. And one of the things I find is that the business owners don't realize that in addition to the money that they have to pay, they have to actually shore up that working capital. So they have to put money in the business to shore up the working capital in addition to what they paid for the business. There's also some very tricky tax implications involved. And so I always tell my clients they need to get the best attorney and the best accountant that they can get to sit with them and work through all the issues in selling the business. So I just had that to add to that particular issue. So
Well, thank you, Catherine.
yeah.
Well, Bob, we heard from Catherine that synergies can make a difference as to whether they should be factored into the standard of value or into the price. What about the motivations? Not every buyer or seller may have the same motivations. Does that make a difference?
It sure does, John. I mean, particular motivations of a buyer seller can significantly impact the sale of the business, the valuation of the business, the deal structure, and probably most importantly, the probability of closing. Seller motivations can range from retirement to financial pressure, maybe lack of a succession plan or succession person in the family to take over. So it might limit negotiation flexibility. And buyers, you have strategic buyers that are, competitors, you have financial buyers, and they look at the value of the business differently as well. So if a seller is motivated by a need to exit quickly, he or she might accept a lower price, while a seller with no strict timeline can hold out for a higher value, maximum value. You might have a seller that is looking for a buyer who will respect the management, the staff, keep them in place. So that may be another motivation in the price, and particularly the buyer he or she might want to sell to. On the buyer side, Catherine touched on synergies with the strategic buyer, a competitor, I'll call it. Um, you as the seller may be able to convince that buyer to pay for some of those synergies, that this is going to be an output of acquiring this business. You'll have increased revenues, lower costs. You may not get all the synergy value that the buyer brings to it, but at least it's part of a negotiation, and you may get some of that as you do your negotiating and transacting with the buyer. And then financial buyers, I think Tom mentioned private equity people. They focus primarily on return on investment and cash flow, and not so much synergy. So they'll have a different um, motivation in coming to a deal. So I think bottom line is, when a seller has motivation to retire, a buyer needing to expand, that's probably a good combination, that the transaction moves faster and with less friction. But lack of a clear seller motivation can make a buyer skeptical, and in those cases, deals fall apart.
Well, thank you, Bob. Tom, obviously, some of the businesses we're talking about, generally private, closely held companies here. Obviously, some of them are family owned and some of them are not family owned. Is there a different dynamic if it's the sale of a family owned business?
Yeah, very, very much so, John. Usually when I get a call from a client that's a family-owned business telling me that they're thinking about selling, or maybe even have a letter of intent if they haven't listened to my advice about not signing it without consulting with me first, I do some gentle probing, because a lot of business owners want to keep the business in the family. And they find out over time that maybe they have children who are not suited for the business, or who have other interests. But it can be an emotional, topic. And so I find out, why are they selling and not keeping the business in the family? And keep in mind, why selling now? But a lot of times, these are folks who are, have been concentrating on their particular business and have not been keeping up on the latest M&A trends, or, how to get the most money for their when they sell. So I talk to them about the process. I talk to them about what they've done to get ready, talk to them about the time commitment, how stressful it's going to be, and how much extra work it's going to be for them. Talk to them about what kind of role they want to play going forward in the business. And especially, even if I'm talking to the CEO and there's a spot for the CEO in the new business, I gently ask, what are the other family members going to be doing? Because, this is an area where family and business interests can cross over, or do cross over. The business might be owned by several brothers, and one of the brothers is head of HR and does a great job taking care of mom, but is only a mediocre head of HR. that is not an unusual situation, and that person is going to be wondering, well, where are they going to fit in at the new company? Are they going to be able to have the lifestyle that they've enjoyed previously? One of the perks of being a family business is that there is a lot of freedom, generally speaking. People are able to take time off when they want, pursue other interests. And there's really a crossover of, can be a crossover of family and business. But also, I talk to them about, the decision-making process, because even if the mom and dad have transferred their equity to the kids and no longer have a vote, they might still have persuasive control. Or it could be that there's a spouse of one of the owners who has an outsized voice about the business and needs to be heard if in order for the family to still be getting along after the sale. Ideally, they've had family meetings to talk about this and talk about the potential sale and what other family members might do afterwards. But frankly, some people are going to do better than others. If, as Bob was saying, a PE-backed firm is often going to be focused, if not entirely, largely on return on investment, and so there's not going to be as patient with somebody wanting to do their own thing. So in particular, the comfortable salaries, company cars, gas cards, titles, and the prestige of being a family business owner are going to be going away. And are they ready for that? And what have they done to plan for their um, next job, or that they're, what they're going to do in the future? And then I talked to them a little bit, again, not being sophisticated about this sort of thing, let them know that they're going to be, even though they've been operating as a company or an LLC all these years and have thought they have protection from personal liabilities, they're insulated by the corporate veil, they're going to be signing documents, saying things about the business that they're going to be personally responsible for. And so they're going to need to be ready to vouch for the company and be prepared for a representation and warranty claim post-closing.
Catherine, you mentioned a little earlier the term synergies. What are synergies, and do buyers always pay for synergies?
Oh, good question. When I'm appraising a standalone entity for litigation and taxes, or an entity for litigation and taxes, I appraise it as standalone and as operating in its current mode. But many buyers are planning to make changes to the purchase business or plan to leverage aspects of the business to create more value. So these changes or attempts at leverage by the buyer are called synergies, and they involve a lot of different aspects of the business. The obvious one is cost synergies, such as reducing admin expenses. There's also revenue synergies. Does the purchase provide access to a customer base or new markets through a new distribution system that enhance the ability to cross-sell or just generally increase revenue? There's also the ability to capitalize on patents or brand names or employee expertise. A large tech firm may purchase a small tech firm just for the expertise of their employee base. I think Bob talked about this as when you're negotiating a sale and there's synergies involved. Many times the synergies value are split between the buyer and seller. At least you want to if you're the seller, you do want to get some of the value for the synergies to the prospective buyer, and that's all about the negotiation. The most interesting synergies that I've seen in my practice, though, involve the purchase of a very small professional firm by a very large corporation, and that was making a significant number of acquisitions. So the owner of the professional firm had a large network and a very good skill set that could effectively be used to facilitate the acquisitions. So the corporation bought the professional services firm primarily to gain access to the person's skills. And there were very significant synergies involved. So that, to me, that was one of the more interesting examples of synergies that I've run across in my practice.
Well, thank you. Bob, let's talk a little bit about some of the components that would be an output from a valuation exercise. There are terms like invested capital, enterprise value, equity value. Are those all the same or thing or different things? And if a company's actually sold, what is the price based upon? Is it based upon one of those items, invested capital, enterprise value, or equity value?
Well, let me try to unpack that question a little bit, John. So you mentioned invested capital. That really represents the total cash from whatever source, debt or equity, that is in the business today. And it doesn't necessarily measure a market-based value, an enterprise value, or an equity value, but it's what's been invested so far in the business. Then you move over to enterprise value, which is more of a fair market value, asking price, selling price measurement than invested capital is. And it's usually the entire company's value, the debt plus the equity minus the cash, because most deals are done on a cash-free, debt-free basis. So enterprise value is debt plus cash, is debt, equity minus the cash, plus or minus working capital adjustments. That is more closely aligned with purchase price or market value than invested capital. And then I think you mentioned equity value as well. And that's the amount that goes to the shareholders. That's kind of how the check is written, that the shareholders receive enterprise value, less these other considerations to come down to the equity price. So the debt is taken out, the cash is taken out, and what you're left with is the equity. And that generally is the final price to shareholders that own the shares of the business. So these different measures of value aren't always the same. They're different, and they have different specific meanings in any transaction. But the final check, generally written to the sellers, is based on the equity value of the business. So I hope that kind of clears that up a little bit.
Catherine, moving a little further earlier in the valuation process, one of the inputs you'd mentioned is cash flows. So what is this term that we hear a lot called EBITDA? And is that one of the metrics of earnings or cash flow that are used? And are there some other metrics that might be used in terms of an input for the valuation process?
Yeah, it's commonly referred to as EBITDA. And when I value a business, I usually value it from three different perspectives: the value of the hard assets, the value of the cash flows, and the value of based on similar sales. So there are a number of multiples that are used when valuing a company based on similar sales, and multiples of EBITDA is one of them, and it's very common. The definition of EBITDA is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. And it's basically a measure of cash flow from operations. And it's a widely used measure of the value of companies. For businesses that I value, which are small privately held businesses, I find that multiples of revenue and multiples of seller discretionary earnings are more reliable measures of estimating value. Seller's discretionary earnings in many cases is the most reliable measure or multiple. It is defined as owner's income and benefits plus operating income plus depreciation and amortization. It's pretty close to EBITDA plus owner's compensation. So that's I do understand though that EBITDA is used more commonly when the companies are multiples, when the companies are larger. Likely those companies that are working with M&A professionals and the like that Tom is working with.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Bob, it sounds like, though, not necessarily all earnings or EBITDA or cash flows are viewed equally, that there could be some variations or some unusual things, or like Catherine's mentioned, what's the discretionary earnings or what is the seller drawing? So maybe there are certain situations where there's a difference between like reasonable compensation of the seller for work done versus what might also be in there is additional return on investment. So it's a long way of circling to there are some terms called pro forma or normalization adjustments. What are they?
Yeah, those two categories, normally, and most businesses will have those adjustments to the EBITDA, called it adjusted EBITDA. Normalization adjustments eliminate non-recurring, non-operational, discretionary expenses to show a normalized profit. I think Tom had mentioned above market rental rates that would be adjusted down. A bloated ownership salary that would be adjusted down in the EBITDA to show more profitability. One-time legal fees might be in there. They would be normalization adjustments, or non-operating income may have occurred in one period, one accounting period. You would take that out and look at a normalized EBITDA based on adjustments like that. Pretty common adjustments. Pro forma, we know what pro forma is looking forward, looking ahead. So you would look at, and Catherine mentioned synergies. You could possibly look at pro forma adjustments from synergies a buyer can realize. If you can have a conversation with the buyer on why those are valuable and why the seller should receive some of that benefit in the purchase price. It's used to reflect, what a run rate for revenues or cost savings could be in the future. So it has some historical basis, but you would adjust pro forma looking forward that this would be an effect going forward on the business and could increase the value. So it's two ways, two methods, two things you have to consider: pro forma and normalization to reflect the ongoing sustained profitability of the business for a buyer. So that's why you would be looking at those kind of adjustments in your negotiations with the buyer.
Thank you. Catherine, from an input perspective, what types of information would a potential buyer generally request if they're looking to evaluate a company for potential acquisition?
Well, the obvious are just the financial statements, the tax returns, employee contracts, information on accounts receivable and payable. Market value of assets is big, particularly for a manufacturer or construction company. The details of any patents, trademarks, customer contracts, operating agreements, information regarding key employees and market information. I just last year I took on a litigation engagement where the business was in the process of being sold to a large buyer, and the buyer asked for a quality of earnings report, and this is an independent analysis that evaluates the accuracy or reliability of the company's financial performance, and it's particularly focused on EBITDA. While I don't see that a lot in my business because of the size of the companies I deal with, Tom, you may see that more often. Is that correct?
Uh, yeah, I'm sorry.
Well, do you see quality of earnings reports in the transactions that you
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And sorry, I thought I was on mute. Yes, the quality of earnings report is getting to be, especially with sponsors that are backed by private equity firms, the quality earnings report is pretty usual nowadays. And I'm not an accountant, but as it's been explained to me, it's reconstituting the financials in a way that um, the PE firm or the buyer might normally be used to. So the seller might be able to get by with just a very basic, QuickBooks of for their financials, and they have no need to do audited financials for sure. And they want to save the expense of that, and they might not even do annual, reviewed financials. So yeah, quality of earnings report it can be pretty normal. Sometimes an offer can even be made to buy the company without the results of that being done yet. So I'm working on a transaction right now where the offer to purchase was made, and the sellers weren't sure what the price was going to be until the quality of earnings report was completed. And knowing that that was going to be come up with some sort of an as Catherine was talking about, an EBITDA number, and there would be a multiple applied to that.
okay, all right.
Thank you. But Bob, when you're doing evaluation, you had mentioned something about pro forma, and Catherine was talking about the types of information that might be requested. What about a forecast of future performance of the business? Is that something that's requested or prepared, and is it important?
Yeah, I would say, John, it's pretty important. It could be, one of the most critical factors in determining a price. I mean, the value of a business is essentially based on the present value of its future cash flows, brought back to present day numbers. Without a forecast, pricing becomes a rear view mirror exercise, looking behind your shoulder rather than looking forward. And it's especially critical, when the markets are changing or there's innovation and you want to look at what the seller can generate, what the buyer can generate looking forward. So you've got, growth rates that you need to apply to a forecast. You have risk assessment, how risky are these projections? What's the risk of achieving these projections? And then finally, the other aspect or the other component of a present value or future cash flow analysis is the terminal value. You've got a projection period of 3 to 5 years, of which you can be somewhat reliable. But after that, you need to estimate the value of the business going into perpetuity, called the terminal value. So those are the components of it. One of the fallbacks, or one of the, I guess, unfavorable views, is that you may have hockey stick projections, which are, sudden massive growth, which, many owners might say, well, we're going to grow like this. That I would be skeptical of something like that, especially if you don't have the capital, um, CapEx component in your projections that would help support a hockey stick growth like that. So those are considerations you have to look at to make sure it makes sense and it's reasonable. And then finally, you have to understand your competition. Are you going to be able to really grow at this rate when you have new competitors coming in the market? One of them may be the buyer. So I refer to this as a discounted cash flow method. I think Catherine alluded to that earlier on, but definitely developing a reliable forecast is critical to most business valuations in an M&A context.
And Bob, you mentioned a discounted cash flow. Is there something called an internal rate of return? And if so, what is that?
Yeah, there is, John, an IRR, internal rate of return. You're you're really looking at a financial measure of, what's the break-even point for the business. You would put in $1 million up front, and then you have cash flows over a period of time. What is the interest rate that brings those two components, the initial investment and the cash flows over time, to zero? That is your IRR. If the IRR is uh, less than your cost of capital, you may or may not go into this investment. If your IRR is greater than your cost of capital, you may consider going into the investment. So it's just a way to look at, when or at what rate of return the initial investment and the projected cash flows, whether positive or negative over time, come out to zero. When will they equal? And then based on that percent, you will make a decision on whether you're going to go forward with the investment or the transaction um, based on that. I hope that answered the question, John. It's a break-even point, basically. That's what it is. Um, and it's the net present value of an investment um, to zero based on your initial investment. So um, includes the time value of money. So that's considered. ROI doesn't always include time value of money. It's an ROI, but over what period of time? IRR does consider a period of time.
Well, thank you. Catherine, so far when we've been talking about price or value, we've been implying that it's a number, but is it always a fixed number? Could there be some variability or contingency to price?
Oh, yeah, definitely, particularly with the small businesses that I work with. Contingent consideration, it's also known as an earnout. And basically, the buyer agrees to pay additional money over a number of years if the business does well. And it can be used also if the buyer and seller do not agree on the outlook for the business or the outlook is uncertain. So um, I've run into it a couple of, a number of times. Two examples include I was working with the sale of an engineering firm, and obviously the employees were vital. Their skill set and their knowledge of the customers and such were really important. So the owner of the business stayed on the business just to keep the turnover for the employees and the customers to a minimum, and that business was sold with an earnout. In another case, the owner died, and it was a service business, and the business did start to lose customers, but there was still the ability to gain those customers back. So I advised the buyer to work with the seller with an earnout situation, and they were able to come to a meeting of minds there as well. And that was really an important lever to use in being able to put together a transaction for that business.
Thank you. Tom, a little earlier, you said that sometimes after an acquisition, there can be something called an RWI claim. So, are there legal claims that can arise after an acquisition? And what can be done to try to avoid or minimize those types of claims?
Correct on that. In the contract for the sale of the business, the seller's going to be asked to make certain representations, effectively promises and warranties, that again, a form of, legal promise that the business is in a certain state of affairs. Um, and so that the contract, depending on the sale price, can have 5 or 8 of those, or it might have 20 or 30 of those. And those are very heavily negotiated. As I was saying before, the shareholders, or certainly the largest shareholders, going to be asked to stand behind any of these promises. So even if the company says, I have this, the company owns this amount of equipment, the shareholder, the major shareholder, is going to be asked to stand behind that and effectively, personally guarantee that. So, it does come up. We spend a lot of time with clients going through the contract. It's typical, for example, to say, if the company is saying we own this number of assets or we have this number of key contracts, there'll be a schedule to the contract that says that they'll list them out. So we will go over that very closely with the client, because there's also an opportunity in there for the client to say, we also have these issues. We have these liabilities that we're asking the buyer to assume, or maybe we own all intellectual property associated with the business except for certain things. So we go through that carefully. We tell clients to, when in doubt, over disclose, err on the side of caution in disclosing any problems. But environmental issues, business license requirements, um, contract fulfillment issues. These are areas where I've seen claims come up. Being thorough and diligent with the contract is the best way to avoid problems. If a seller has any kind of a messy or ambiguous business problem, try to get ahead of it, try to fix it before you get to the point where you're dealing with the contract. But make sure you properly disclose it. Once the sale takes place, it's in human nature. The business owner is often mentally moved on, and they don't want to deal with a claim after the closing that could be expensive, and especially when they might have to come out of pocket to pay for it or take care of it. So they, on top of that, they'll be paying the lawyers to deal with it, their lawyers to deal with it, and they no longer have company employees or resources to address it. In one deal we worked on recently, the seller asked that post-closing, that her CFO be able to deal with these matters post-closing. So even though that CFO is going to be an employee of the new company, she, bought time of his in the contract for him to deal with anything that might come up post-closing.
Well, thank you. So, Tom, as a follow-up, where we're getting down to the last few minutes of our hour, how would parties reduce the complexity from a legal perspective in the sale of a small business? It sounds like there are legal things that need to be addressed. Legal advice may be very important, but how do they avoid unnecessary legal complexity?
Yeah, there's I think there's two parts to this. One is, and Catherine and Bob have each alluded to this, earlier, getting prepared. So the business owner getting their ducks in a row before they put their business on the sale block. Are there any unresolved lawsuits or contract disputes? Is your intellectual property protected? Do you have any key contracts, that might lapse? And are those contracts assignable to a new buyer? Are there any environmental issues? So these are, getting ahead of, the situation is important. Fixing anything that could be problematic is just going to it's going to make for a much smoother closing process. And then, as I mentioned earlier, um, having a good letter of intent is absolutely critical. That you can save a lot of legal time later by having a really robust letter of intent. If you have an effective lawyer helping you, an experienced lawyer helping you, you can negotiate a lot of the terms in that document, and it'll save a lot of legal time later on. A seller is never going to have more leverage than at this critical time. The buyer obviously wants to buy their business and is spending time and money on it. And this is the seller's opportunity to negotiate more favorable business terms, but also more favorable legal terms, including limits on what a buyer might claim after the fact. Um, so this is again, just an absolutely critical um, point. Probably the most important thing I can recommend to somebody who's thinking about selling their business is to take that extra bit of time, share the letter of intent with your lawyer, and don't sign it until you get their input.
Tom, final question I'm going to ask you, and Bob or Catherine may want to weigh in too. Under professional business valuation standards, one of the first steps in an evaluation is to define the subject business. And so is a lot of what you're talking about from a legal perspective focused on that issue, defining basically what is the equity interest or the assets and liabilities that are being transferred?
Yeah, I mean it should be you know I think a lot of business owners have a handle on that. But there's a difference between a stock sale and an asset sale. So Catherine mentioned earlier, a lot of small business transactions are a buyer buying the assets, but wanting to avoid liabilities, they don't want to assume any liabilities. With an equity transaction, a buyer gets everything. They get the good and the bad. Um, Now, that can be very effective when you have a business where avoiding disruption is critically important. If somebody's got a key contract and they don't want to upset the apple cart with one of their prime customers by asking them to consent to the sale of a new business, that can be an important step. But yes, making sure the seller understands what they're selling is critical there.
Thank you. So in closing, I want to express on behalf of Financial Poise our appreciation to each of our speakers, Catherine Puffer, Bob Muser, and Tom Walsh, for sharing your insights and being generous with your time today. We greatly appreciate the conversation. And most importantly, we appreciate all of our viewers and our on-demand viewers. Thank you very much for participating and attending today's program. You have the email addresses for each of us in the slide deck. Please feel free to reach out to any of us if you have some follow-up questions. And we look forward to seeing you again on a future program. Thank you very much. And this concludes our program today. Take care. Bye-bye.